Good morning, my fellow learners. My name is Juan Jose Gutierrez, and as you probably know by now, I'm your instructor for the remainder of the semester. This is SBS200, Introduction to Social Sciences, and today we're going to be talking about, and I'll be explaining the very concept of culture and the human condition as part of our exploration of different aspects and different topics in the social sciences. I hope this is not too long of a presentation for you, but there's many aspects of culture that we need to explain, some of which I'm certain you are familiar with, and many others that you might just not be familiar with. So let's get on with it. As you know, I am an anthropologist, and I will be presenting to you this morning the anthropologist's perspective on culture. You probably know that for anthropologists, this is the core of not just our the focus of our investigation, but how we think and we see human behavior and the human experience through culture and the cultural lens. And then we stem out to any other aspects of human experience, the economy, the politics, institutions, and you name it, but always having into consideration the very idea of culture. So we should probably look into the very definition of culture so that we are in agreement as to what's the meaning of this key central concept. Why do we pay so much attention to the concept of culture? Well, because there's this deep understanding that if anything is unique to the human experience, is precisely our symbolic ability. And the result of our symbolic ability is culture. Let's explore that definition. So, what are the different characteristics of culture? Culture, on the one hand, is learned. It's not something that we are genetically endowed with, but we learn our cultural context. It is shared. It is something that we have in common with other individuals. This is what we create these fields that we call cultures. What is your culture? And I'm from this culture, you're from that culture. What we're saying actually is that we share certain traits, certain likings, certain traditions with other people similar to us, and we feel like at home right there, and that's what we call that culture. Think, for example, people in southern states in the US. They have a shared culture, experience, food, and way of viewing things that is unique to them. So we can identify that as a cultural area, and people from the south states will see themselves as southerners, very much so like people in California, people in other countries and different cultures see themselves as belonging to these groups. So what are we saying when we say we belong to this culture? We're basically saying we have learned certain behaviors and patterns that we share with other peoples, and that's what we call a culture. So culture is, in that sense, pattern. There are patterns of behavior, things that you expect people will engage in doing. If you think of the Hutterites that it's a group of immigrants who came from Russia. They have very specific roles to be played by different groups, gender groups, and age groups, and they have these patterns of behavior that are dictated by this culture that is shared and learned. But culture is not a box that is solid, that it's immutable through time, but culture actually can change through time. In that sense, we say that culture is adaptive. When things change, then culture change. Think of the Native Americans as a prime example of this. They had their ways before the expansion of the Western expansion of the U.S. and the control of their lands and their territories, and they adapted to new ways in order to survive, and in some cases to thrive. Some of the adaptations they went through were really positive, and some others were actually quite negative. and but they have adapted to new conditions. In this case, I think unfavorable conditions that we have presented them with, and that are the subject of so much concern and so much consideration. And we should continue doing that consideration. Anyways, they have adapted. We all adapt. Cultures are again not immutable, solid objects, but elements that pattern our conduct that will change through time. And uh, and of course, the main characteristic of culture is that it is symbolic. We signify, we identify by generating and using different symbols. And you probably do remember that a symbol is an object that stands in lieu of another object or another reality. It's, it's like a flag. A flag stands for a group of people that live in a territory with certain language or languages and that are identified together as belonging to the same nation. That will be a flag. And the flag is a symbol of such nation, right? So again, don't ever think of culture as something that is solid, immutable, impermeable. It's more, it's not so much, the metaphor wouldn't be a box. The metaphor is a cloud, and clouds are constantly changing, moving, and guess what? They're actually mixing and interacting with other clouds, with other cultures, and transforming themselves as this interaction happens. That is what's culture. But the cloud is there, and we can identify the cloud and see the cloud for what it is, as a reality out there. Okay. Um, so to sum up what I'm saying, how can we define culture? Well, culture would basically be a set of learned behaviors and ideas that humans acquire as members of society. Sets of learned behaviors and ideas that humans acquire as members of a society. We humans use culture to adapt and to transform the world in which we live. We've been so successful as species in this planet because we've used our symbolic abilities to the max in terms of how we can adapt and survive in our environment. We're really good at it. Part of what culture does is it enables us to create sets of complex rules and behaviors that when they solidify, they become what we call institutions. Institutions are nothing tangible in itself. Think of the university, for example. If I ask you, you're walking around campus and I ask you, what is this? You will say, it's a university. And I will tell you, I don't see a university. I see buildings, I see grass, I see walkways, I see individuals. But how is this a university? How is this different from what I see in a city? What is it that makes of this set of things that are around you, buildings, spaces, and individuals, what makes of that a university? It's us making an abstraction, and that abstraction comprised of rules of engagement. And those rules, actually very abstract things, is what actually the university is. If we don't have those rules of engagement, we don't have a university. So it's actually quite abstract and not as tangible as we might think. I hope this is not getting you confused, but again, a university is not the physical building, but the sets of rules that we use to engage with each other. Now, the role of culture in human life is rooted in philosophical ideas. So very much so, as I was explaining, that the university is not something physical, tangible in of itself. The same happens with the roots of culture. It's rooted in ideas. The cultures of the Western civilizations are rooted in philosophical schools that were based mostly in the Greek area thousands of years ago. Let's go over some of these philosophical ideas that give rise to our current ways of seeing things. So let's start with dualism and idealism. So dualism, it's a philosophical school that actually sees or considers the whole of reality as comprised of real, touchable, empirically accessible things, and then underneath that or beyond that, another set that somehow relates to those objects that are of untangible nature. And so the reality has this dual nature. Think, for example, of a lamp or the computer that you have in front of you. For a dualist, that person would say, yeah, there's the material object, but there's the definition of the object without which the object wouldn't exist. So you cannot have a computer without the concept of the computer. And because the concept of the computer that is immaterial, because that concept exists, is that you can have the computer. And that duality is necessary for existence to be what it is. An offshoot of this dualistic conception of reality is the idealism that actually considers that ideal world, that untangible world, to be more perfect than the one that we see. And it is more perfect, and not only that, but it is also the seat and the source of the essence of who we are. So there's sort of a pre-existing idea of what humanity is, and because of that idea is that we can be what we are. Kind of complicated concepts, but nonetheless ideas that have been defining the cultural place in which we live, and we have evolved as nations, as individuals, as families through time. Another solidly grounded in history view of things, and you can trace this back also to even pre-Socratic times, the time before Plato and Socrates, which are mostly dualistic, the founders of the dualistic view of things, is materialism. And materialism, actually what it considers is that it is only material activities and physical bodies that exist, nothing else. So you would ask them, and what about the idea of a computer, and the idea of a lamp, or the idea of a human? Wouldn't have that to pre-exist for the computer, the lamp, or the humans to be? And they would say, no, quite the opposite. It's because humans exist that we have a sense or an idea. It's an abstraction. The computer, someone built the computer, but not because they have the idea of a computer, but because they saw a process that was able to compute, to create additions and subtractions. And because you have that idea, you can create a more complex object, and then that more complex object, you make the abstraction, and then you call that more complex object a computer. So the idea of the computer comes after some form of created object that will do that work. So in order for us to be able to call a computer, you need to have a computer. So the material goes before the abstraction. And there's no two worlds. The abstractions are part of this material world. And they will see abstractions as just simply physical connections that we make in our bodies and in our minds, that are in our brains, and then the minds will be that abstraction that happens in the brain. Complicated, huh? Another concept that has been central in anthropological studies, and one that you really need to understand if you want to understand what's anthropology today, is the concept of the holistic approach. Holism assumes that mind and body, individuals and society, individuals and the environment, interpenetrate and even define one another. So, from the anthropological perspective, holism argues that objects and environments interpenetrate and even define one another. So the whole is more than the sum of its parts. In other words, if you want to understand the human experience, you will have to not just look at the individual in isolation, but you will need to bring into consideration the whole of its context, meaning its environment, its social environment, and the network of relationships in which that individual or that culture lives. So for us as humans, as this unique species that we are, what's most important is that the biocultural, not just the biological, but the biological plus the cultural heritage or biocultural heritage, it has produced the species that we are today. And it is a species that uses culture to even change its biological nature. Think how sophisticated our understanding of our biological makeup is today, that we can even play with it and change it for good and for not so good. And that's part of who we are as a being. We can often understand humans just by looking at the biology of it or just by looking at the cultural aspects, but we need to look at those complex parts of this complex system as they interact with each other. One of the aspects that has been probably most controversial of anthropology and cultural anthropology in specific is this idea of cultural relativism and the counterpart that is ethnocentrism. So as anthropologists, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, start visiting different parts of the world in terms of not just knowing that it exists, but studying and understanding it, they start developing a respect and understanding for the complex systems of associations that humans created in many different parts of the world. And they also saw that these complex systems were marvelously well adapted to those specific environments. And then it was natural that they would realize that they would see the awkwardness of their own Western civilization ways in terms of living in those parts. Think, for example, of our Western ways in a remote island in the Pacific, or our Western ways in the Antarctica or in the polar zones. Of course, many of our institutions and ways and customs were just absolutely nonsensical in those contexts. So they started developing a sense of respect for those different cultures there, and they clearly understood that each culture has its own internal system that is well adapted, and therefore to consider that our ways, the Western ways, were the most advanced was something that needed some challenging and reconsideration. The fact that the consideration that Western ways are the ones that are more advanced comes from social Darwinistic ideas of I would say, and most people accept that it is a misguided understanding of evolution. So they would propose that, hey, if certain animals are best adapted, you see that adaptation in the control that that animal has over the context in which the animal or organism lives. Therefore, that's the superior organism. But in reality, what we have is a misunderstanding of evolution, because on that account, cockroaches are better adapted than humans, because cockroaches will be roaming the planet long after we are gone. Particularly if we go out on a major nuclear blast, that someday seems to be quite a possibility, right? Because cockroaches are well adapted and will resist those changing conditions. That's kind of a sad understanding of evolution, right? So a superior organism is not the one that controls the others, but the one that is adapted to it. And there has to be some level of humility in terms of understanding how not just one is adapted over the others, but how it interacts with others. So in that sense, cultural relativism challenges these social Darwinistic views and sees the importance of understanding how each culture in the planet has its own relevance and importance, and how all of those cultures are interrelated and oftentimes interdependent. In that sense, cultural relativism was a call for a balance and for a sustainable balance.